Anders Wilson had always been afraid to fly. From as far back as he could remember, he'd had a recurring nightmare of him being on an airplane when suddenly a hole opens up on the side and Anders is sucked out, watching the plane crash as he hurls towards his own death. Anders had never gone on a vacation or a business trip that he couldn't drive to or take a train. Today, as he checked his bag at the airline, he was actually feeling as though he might vomit. "Come on, man," he said, trying to give himself a pep talk, channeling what he thought his older brother might say to him. "Thousands, probably millions of people do this every day. It's safer than driving a car. You're more likely to get bit by a shark while standing at the ninth hole holding a steel rod during a rainstorm." Or some such bull crap, he thought. "Have a nice flight, Mr. Wilson," said the woman behind the counter. If he had to pick her out of a lineup later, he knew that he wouldn't be able to. His vision seemed blurry, his heart racing. He walked to his terminal, holding his carry-on bag, which was filled with the pictures of him and his brother Mason. He'd even brought that baseball that his older brother had caught during that Diamondbacks-Yankees World Series game. He'd even gotten Randy Johnson to sign it. Johnson was a real asshole, too. Didn't appreciate his fans even one bit. But Mason had somehow charmed even bitter Johnson into signing it for his little brother. Maybe Johnson was on a high from winning the World Series, but Anders didn't think so. Mason was always a charmer. He'd brought the letters the two had exchanged when Anders was really struggling in college. No email from Mason. He wanted to feel the paper and hold the pen in his hand. He said it helped convey what he was really trying to say if he wasn't just tapping away on a keyboard. Anders wouldn't be flying today if he hadn't gotten the worst news of his life just 2 days earlier. Mason, always the one for adventure, never afraid of anything, especially not flying. Mason was rock climbing with some buddies, and there was a slide, and a large loose rock hit Mason in the head. By the time they got him to the hospital, there was no hope of saving him. He fought, though. Boy, did he fight. He hung on longer than most would, or even could. His brave heart still beating at the end when there was no more brain activity. And here was Anders, feeling sick about getting on an airplane. The two could not be more different, he thought to himself. And what now? Mason was his rock. He felt wobbly in his head, his world tilting, off kilter without that balance of his brother holding him steady. Anders' section was called to board the plane, and for a quick second he thought that he might actually throw up before he even got onto the plane. Once on board, he found a seat, an aisle seat. Thank God for that, he thought. He could get to the toilet faster if need be. He placed his bag in the storage bin carefully. He didn't want to bend anything inside. And he took his seat, fastened his seatbelt, and as soon as he was able, he ordered a Jack and Coke. No, make it a double, he told the flight attendant. When he was feeling comfortably numb, he walked to the bathroom, and on his way back to his seat he passed another passenger, and with the back of his hand he bumped up against something hard. He quickly glanced down and caught just a mere glimpse of a gun before the man pulled his jacket back over it and continued on his way. Anders got back to his seat. His forehead was beading with sweat, his hands shaking. He looked around to see if anyone else had noticed. Did anyone else look alarmed? No, he didn't think so. He grabbed a cocktail napkin and scrawled a note onto it. He stopped the flight attendant and handed it to her. He whispered for her to read it. "Hurry, it's important." She walked 2 aisles away and read the note. "There's a man with a gun on this flight," it read. He watched her when she rushed past him, heading towards the cockpit. He was relieved that she seemed to be as concerned as he was. The man whom he had passed was coming out of the toilet, and he sat in his seat. Anders kept an eye on him, watching his hands, watching his demeanor. Within minutes, the flight attendant came out, and as she was walking down the aisle, she made eye contact with Anders, and he was sure that she was coming over to him, but she didn't. She stopped several seats ahead and bent down to the man. To that man. The man with the gun. He saw her try and slip the note into his hand without Anders seeing, but he saw it. What the hell was going on? Anders' mind was racing now. Were they working together? Were they both going to take this plane down? Was the pilot in on it as well? The man turned his head and he looked back at Anders. Anders looked down, not wanting to make eye contact, wishing he had not seen the gun, wishing that things were not going this way. What should he do? He had to do something. What would Mason do? Mason would take charge. Mason wouldn't sit here sweating and shaking, he growled to himself. Then the man stood up, slowly, as if to not look jumpy, to not bring attention to himself. Then he began to walk towards Anders, the attendant right behind him. Anders, suddenly, without thought, stood up and yelled, "Gun! There's a gun!" and began to rush the man, which is when the man took out his gun and shot at Anders twice. One tore through his midsection, one whizzed past him and struck the window in the aisle 2 aisles back. There was a rush of wind as the window began to crack. Screaming. Everyone was screaming. Anders tumbled back as the man strode towards him. Suddenly, a large hole opened on the side of the plane, and before he knew what was happening, Anders felt himself being violently pulled through the air, slamming against the seats that were still bolted down, and finally being thrust outside of the plane. His lungs were burning, his body beginning to freeze, and before he died, he saw the plane, with bodies being hurled out of the hole in its side, rushing towards the earth. Anders' last thought was, "My dream." The next day, on the national news, they ran a story of how a man had sent a note to an attendant stating that he had a gun. The attendant had told the pilot, who radioed into the tower asking for assistance at landing, and was informed that there was an air marshal on board, and upon trying to restrain the man attacked the air marshal, and the air marshal had shot him. There would be an investigation into how the plane was taken down.
Hi everyone, make sure to subscribe to Exit Live and give this video a big thumbs up. And don't forget to share with all of your friends.